Hello, friends. Welcome back to BUSS1040. Here in the macroeconomics section of the course. We're going to be talking a little bit about macroeconomics. We're going to be talking about first GDP, the business cycle here in week 11. In week 12, we're going to talk about inflation, focusing on that, the CPI, the usage. And in week 12, we're going to talk about government policies, fiscal and monetary policy, more so monetary policy, and its effects on macroeconomics. One of the reoccurring charts of reoccurring models that we're going to be using is the Keynesian cross. So that's something that we visit quite a bit, and then so yeah, it's a lot of content to be crammed into 3 weeks, and then so yeah, we're just gonna get into it. Let me minimize my webcam, and if you notice at the top right, it is 2:07 a.m. on a Sunday morning, but I have to bring you guys this review video. So let me put on my study glasses, and we'll get into it. All right, so here's the actual slides for the lectures, and then it's a good way, I think, for me to go over the review content. We're going to go through slide by slide. We're going to talk about the content, and then I have 2 cups of trusty coffee. I can't tell if you guys can see, but that's coffee right there, and then this is another cup of coffee right there. I am wide awake at a 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Very good. If I get too tired, I accidentally clip the mints right here. I want to bang out the entire macro section before the sun rises right here in Sydney here at 5:40 a.m. All right. So, hey, with Buzz 1040 Week 11, GDP and business cycles. For more of the complicated topics, we're going to be going to the notes as a reference. All right, so let's get right into it. So, macroeconomics, the past 10 weeks, really been focusing on macroeconomics. Macroeconomics really focuses on the individual actors, individual actors as in consumers, individual actors as firms, individual actors as firms, how firms interact with each other. However, macroeconomics focuses on the aggregate phenomenon. So not just a consumer, not just a company, but the totality. And how these actors and agents move and behave within an entire economy. Now, in many ways, this is related to microeconomics. The basic principles of demand and supply all still holds true. However, it becomes aggregate demand and aggregate supply, where everything is totaled together. So we're going to really be seeing a lot of that. So here as an introduction to that macroeconomics. So in today's in this review video, we're going to be talking about macroeconomics, what it is, what's the difference to micro, what's the connection to micro, and how is it important to our understanding of economics as a whole. Then we're going to talk about gross domestic product, GDP, and a slow circular flow diagram, the different ways, or the 3 ways we're going to be measuring GDP. Okay, whether it's the expenditure model, the income model, or whether it be another model. Okay, so that's how we're gonna be exploring different ways of GDP, whether it be the value add model, the expenditure, or the income model. Then we're going to be talking about the business cycle. In ACCT, we learned about the development of the life cycle of business. The business cycle is a little bit different. It's actually quite different from a life cycle of a business. It talks about the booms and busts, the peaks and the troughs, and how economics really moves in a cycle. And then we're going to be talking about the Keynesian cross. It's one of the models that we revisit when we first talk about the Keynesian cross in relation to GDP. GDP potential versus, and then we're going to talk about inflation and how overheating economies will lead to inflation, as illustrated through the Keynesian cross. Then we're going to be talking about the Keynesian cross in relation to government intervention and monetary policies. Then we're going to do a full version of the model with fiscal policy, and it will be a good summary. So what is macroeconomics? It really is the aggregate phenomenon of the entire economy. So it's the aggregate of big picture items like business cycles. Okay, rather than just talking about one firm's interaction with another, the monopolies, the oligopolies, the market. The monopolistic competition, the perfect. We're not just talking about that. We talk about cycles of business interactions. Okay, as a whole. When I talk about inflation, so inflation is a persistent rise in aggregate price levels from period to period. So that's aggregate, it's a totality. And we'll talk about long run growth. Then we talk about development as separate from microeconomics during the Great Depression and consider effects of fiscal and monetary policy. So a big actor within macroeconomics is government, whereas in microeconomics is more about the individual firms and the individual agents. So yeah, here we can see the Twitter accounts for micro and macro firms and how they're really connected in the two interconnected disciplines. All right, so let's talk about domestic product, gross domestic product, and a circular flow diagram. So how do you value the economic activities of a country? Okay, so GDP really measures how much economic activity occurs within a country. Okay, so GDP measures the flows over time. Okay, the flows could be measured through the money going out, the money coming in, and the money changing hands. Okay, so the greater the GDP, the more economic activity is within a country. Okay, the less GDP, the smaller the GDP, the less economic activity is occurring within a country. So we could, and it contributes different aggregate activities. Let me change the seating position and change different aggregate activities by using the monies as a baseline. Okay. And once again, GDP is calculated through only looking at final goods and services. This is to avoid double counting. Okay, for example, here's a really good example. If I purchase bananas by a cafe to make banana bread, only the banana bread is counted within the GDP, rather than bananas purchased at the grocery store. Because that will avoid double counting and basically doubling up of economic activity. Domestic means the economic activity within a country. Okay, within the nationality, within the geographic locations of a country. Whereas in this globally interconnected world, a lot of corporations have operations outside of the country. Okay, for example, think of multinational companies: ExxonMobil, Apple, Google, Amazon. Okay, TSMC. Tesla, for example, a lot of these have revenues of more than 50% from outside of the geographic locations. Now, GDP does not consider these revenues or these income, even in the income approach of GDP calculation, as within the country. Okay, because the source comes from foreign. Okay, it's non-domestic. Right, so and so if you want to calculate that, you have to calculate that with gross national product, where in addition to expenditure, government spending, exports minus imports, and then you also have to add on income from outside of the country from domestic firms. Okay. All right. So one thing that's really prevalent when we talk about GDP is nominal versus real. Okay. So when we think of nominal, we just think of numbers. Okay. Numbers. Take it as its face value. When we talk about real GDP or real figures, what we always have to do is take into account the effects of inflation. Okay. Once again, inflation is basically a given, but it's basically a given that there will be inflation that occurs within an economy. So when real GDP, when we want to look at GDP, we want to take out the effects of inflation. Okay, that makes a lot of sense because once again, for example, Turkey may be experiencing 20% inflation. So even if there is zero nominal GDP growth, there's zero real GDP growth, nominal GDP figures will be greater by 20%. Now that really skews your understanding of GDP figures. It really skews the figures of economic activity. Once again, economic activity is denominated within the currency, the domestic currency of the country. Taiwanese dollars in Taiwan, Japanese yen in Japan, Chinese yuan and yen a little different, Chinese yuan in China. Okay, so it's denominating in its domestic currency. Now, there may be high inflation in domestic currency that does not correspond, does not translate into real GDP. So there's difficulty in comparing GDP in different years because of different inflation figures. So therefore, we want to use something called the GDP deflator, okay, in order to ensure that instead of reporting nominal GDP, we have to report real GDP. So real GDP tries to control the changes in general price levels. We're going to talk about inflation in week 12's content to allow comparisons of the value of production in different years. Okay, so we go to an example that's not really relevant. But prices in 2020 changed by $1 per banana, for example. All right, so the fixed price weighting better captures a change in volume of production. Okay. And this is really where the GDP deflator comes. It takes out the effect of inflation, and it takes out the effect of inflation on nominal GDP figures to give you the real GDP figures. So the GDP deflator is an index, okay? It's an index measure of the general price levels in a given year that converts nominal includes inflation, into real GDP, stripped out of inflation. So real GDP equals nominal GDP over the GDP deflator times 100. So this index means the GDP deflator is set to 100 in the base year, and a value such as 140 means that price level has increased by 40%, which is absolutely bonkers, ridiculous. 4% inflation would be considered high. That's 40% you need to get out. All right. So we also talked about chain weighting. So this is minimizing the distortion of large changes relative to pricing. The pricing is really a big culprit in throwing off GDP figures, because GDP is denominated within currencies. So chain weighting uses real growth of real GDP on fixed current and or previous year prices. Real GDP constructs based on a gross year, so then the GDP deflated is constructed through nominal GDP divided by real GDP. So if you take this and you substitute it here, then you will cancel out. Okay, you will get GDP equals GDP, which is which means the formula makes sense. Here we can see nominal GDP for Australia. Nominal GDP, once again, includes inflation. So this is not adjusted for inflation. And here we can see real GDP. So they're pretty much the same, but you can see a little bit of difference, and that will come through inflation. So measuring a GDP in practice. Now here's where we talk about some interesting subjects. Now there are three approaches to measuring GDP. In theory, in principle, all three of these approaches should yield the same result. Okay, final goods approach, value added approach, and income approach. Regardless of what you choose, you should get the same result of GDP. You should get the same result of economic activity within a country. Now, why is this? If we think about it practically, what does GDP comprise of? Okay, expenditures, so individual consumption, plus government consumption, plus exports minus imports. That is GDP. Okay, that's GDP. That's how we measure economic activity within a country. Now, if you intuitively think about this, when I spend money within a country, where does the money go? Okay, it goes to another person. Okay, so it becomes another person or another company's income. So my spending is equal to another company's income. The government's spending is equal to a person's or a company's income. Okay, so that is where final goods approach is, where you look at what is purchased. Okay, what is purchased, and then through what is purchased, you calculate the GDP or the aggregate. Aggregate means total, or the total economic activity within a country. Okay. However, if we look at the income approach, whatever you spend should be equal to whatever other people within a country receives. So you could also see whatever people receive could also be calculated as the aggregate economic activity within a country. Now, value add means the difference between what companies buy versus what companies sell their goods at. And that should also equal total economic activity. So let's go into depth. So here's the circular flow diagram. Here's labor, here's production. So when you buy something from a factory, the factory receives the same amount of money as you buy. Of course, there's a 10% GST tax that goes to the government, but government also spends money. So that sort of cancels out. So here we can see a sort of circular flow diagram. Let's look at a better circular flow diagram. So your spending is somebody else's consumption. So it doesn't matter if you look at your spending figures or you look at somebody else's consumption, or somebody else's received the revenue figure. These two should be broadly equal. So in principle, whichever factor you choose, which one of these three, the consumption, the expenditure, or the value add method, you should come to the same conclusion for what the GDP figure is. So here's the final goods approach. It adds up the expenditure on domestic production of final goods and services by different groups. So there's household consumption, there's firm consumption, which is called investment, there's government purchases, and there's also exports minus imports. So this is what we see as GDP. So this is the aggregate economic activity within a country. Basically all economic activity within a country could be summarized into GDP. Okay, investments include residential construction and accumulation, depletion of production and whatnot. Government purchases include transfer payment of interest and government debt and whatnot. So yeah, this is the final goods approach. The value add approach should also equal the final goods approach in principle. The sum of value added at a stage of domestic production. Firm revenue minus intermediate goods. So you purchase bananas, you make banana bread, you sell it, versus when you buy banana bread or when you sell banana bread, that should all have the same amount of economic transactional value. Okay, which means whatever method that you choose, they should all be equal. Here's the income approach, should also be equal. Now, GDP is not the end all be all, as much as a lot of economists will want it to be. So, let me take a coffee sip. GDP does not include many valuable non-market activities. Now, here's a really good example that I really like to use: nurseries, daycares, okay, or nurseries, for example. That's a good example. Children 2 to maybe 5 before you go to school at 6, 2 to 5. Okay, that's 3 year windows. Children could stay at home and be taken care of by their parents or their grandparents. However, children could also be sent to a nursery. Now, if you're sent to a nursery, you have to pay the nursery some money. Now, that is included in GDP figures because your spending is captured in the expenditure method, or your spending becomes their revenue is also captured in the income approach. Okay, so if you send your children to nurseries during school days or during days, and then that is counted. Okay, then that is counted within the GDP figures. However, if your children stay with you at home, that is not counted within GDP figures because there's no expenditure, there's no income, there's no value add. Okay, so GDP does not capture a lot of non-market activities. Also, a lot of illicit activities and illegal activities are not being captured within GDP figures. Another thing is GDP does not take into account the quality of the quality and the efficacy and sort of the morality of where the money is coming from. Okay, there could be a lot of dirty money, such as oil producing countries. There's also be a lot of clean money. Okay, for example, high tech manufacturing like Taiwan or something. Poverty and economic inequality is not really reflected in GDP, but there's other measures such as Gini coefficients and whatnot, that is used to measure GDP. That's better indicators of poverty or economic inequality, or even the HDI, for example. But overall, GDP is highly informative. Per capita real GDP, well, real once again because you want to take out the effects of inflation, is correlated with higher standards of living. So generally, there's a really high correlation between high GDP and high standards of living, and low GDP and low standards of living. Because a higher GDP refers to more economic activity, which usually correlates to more better living standards, which richer people, which highly correlates to richer people with high purchasing power, parity, leading to better qualities of life. Yeah. So here we can see quite a good correlation between the Better Life Index and the GDP per capita. Here you can see additional information about that. Here's quarterly real GDP growth for Australia, and we can see quite a lot of disruption during COVID and overcorrection is sort of coming down right now. All right, so let's now talk about the business cycle and the Keynesian cross model. So let's sort of expand our understanding of GDP a little bit more. Okay, so the business cycle. This is the idea that there are booms and busts. There are booms season. There are seasons where everything is go, grow. There are also declines. There are also recessions. There are also tough times for businesses. Okay, so one definition of the business cycle is the recurring deviation from real GDP. So real GDP could be growing steadily over time, or it could be pretty flat over time. However, real economic activity within a country could fluctuate by huge levels. Okay, fluctuates because of stability, because of confidence, because of external factors like COVID, okay, because of wars and whatnot. However, real or actual economic activity within a country is rather stable. So this is where real GDP or real economic activity is given by Y. Okay. And then the potential level is given by Y star. So this corresponds to full normal employment of resources. So we're going to talk about employment in next weeks as well when we talk about inflation and employment, and how the Phillips curve really ties those two ideas together. So full employment of resources must be estimated. So there isn't an authority that comes out, full resource employment is at how many amount. No, it's an estimated amount with a percentage deviation given as this. Okay, so real minus estimated divided by estimated times 100. That will be the percentage deviation of the real GDP from the potential level of GDP. And this is often referred to as the output gap. So here we can see output gaps. So there was quite a big output gap between the actual GDP and the potential or the real GDP in 2020 during the COVID pandemic, and then there's quite a big overswing, also overcorrection, that a real GDP is less than the potential level, and now we're actually seeing that come down. Now, what a Keynesian model does is it gives an abstract of the reality. So once again, reality models reflect reality. So it's an abstract of the reality to help us illustrate how to make predictions in the relation to current economic activity, current GDP levels, to the expected or the full employment GDP levels. So of course there are some assumptions. Some easy assumptions is that it takes potential output of potential GDP as an estimated given by fixing the price levels, and there's also the expectation that firms will fluctuate a quantity and demand sold rather than changing prices, because prices are assumed to be sticky. This is the idea that firms do not really want to fluctuate their prices. Once again, stability and confidence is quite key factors for firms. And there's also what we call the sticker price or the menu costs to firms. When they want to change prices, they take reputational damage. They also take a lot of unforeseen costs when they want to change prices. So thus the model is for business cycles in the short run only explains the output gap, not inflation in the long run growth. Okay. So here we can see planned aggregate expenditure. Planned aggregate expenditure it really shows the difference between aggregate expenditure, which is basically GDP, with what the potential or the planned aggregate expenditure is. So this model builds off an expenditure approach to measuring GDP. Okay, so here aggregate expenditure is basically GDP. Planned aggregate expenditure is basically consumer spending plus planned investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Okay, so IP right here is planned investment rather than actual investment. So it's forward looking in nature. So the consumption function right here is the largest single component of planned aggregate expenditure is consumption. Once again, consumption comprises of 5%. It's like 65% of the GDP in 65 in the US, like 55 in Australia. So it's the biggest component of planned aggregate expenditure. And in the model, a consumer or consumption is assumed to depend on disposable income. So this is the idea that as disposable income increases, okay, taxes will increase proportionally or increases through the brackets, but also disposable income will increase as income increase. So yeah. So T is taxes. So once again, the consumption function is given by endogenous and exogenous factors. Okay. So let's look at C bar. C bar captures everything other than disposable income that affects consumption. So this is exogenous factors. This could be the wealth effect, such as when you see home values go up, you feel richer. So that's the wealth effect. So you spend more money. Therefore, your consumption goes up, even though perhaps your income did not go up. Whereas, for example, if C y minus T means your consumption as a function of marginal propensity to consume. So marginal propensity to consume, once again, marginal is the idea that if you make $1 more, how much do you spend? Okay, so if I make $1 more, I spend 60 cents. That means I have a marginal propensity to consume of 60%. And 40% goes to like savings or whatnot. And that is also a function of income minus taxes. So this is the consumption function, and it's the biggest component for planned aggregate expenditure. Once again, because so we want to understand how changes in one variable affects changes in other variables. So when wealth effect goes up, for example, when assets value goes up, when stock values goes up, when house prices go up, consumers feel wealthier, therefore consumers spend more money, perhaps even when their income did not increase. Therefore, C bar increases. When C bar increases, C increases. C is consumer spending. When C increases, once again, C is the biggest component for planned aggregate expenditure. Therefore, aggregate expenditure goes up. Okay, so this is how we see how changes in one element of the economy influences the entire function, entire calculus. So the consumption function for marginal propensity to consume. So here's the function: consumer spending equals the consumer spending of exogenous effects plus consumer spending income minus taxes. So the slope right here is C. Small c is the income and how one additional unit of income will translate into an additional unit of spending. Okay, so that is the marginal propensity to consume. That would be the slope. y minus y, new y minus y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1 sort of situation. In this case, it's c2 minus c1 minus y minus t2 minus 2 minus 2y minus 2t. Okay, so that's the idea of the slope. Okay, well, if one how does one unit increase in y minus t translate into unit effects of c's, of big c's, or consumption? That would just be the little c. Okay. So this is the idea of exogenous versus induced consumption. So C bar is exogenous consumption. This is the idea that it's not really it's not really up to how much income a person makes that affects how much they spend. Okay, wealth effects, COVID-19 shocks. For example, if you start seeing that the pandemic happens, or you accept a recession to happen, you will perhaps cut down on your spending because you want to save more money in the event, have a bigger rainy day fund in the event of bigger economic shocks going forward. C as a function of y minus t is induced or endogenous consumption. This is the idea that as you have make $1 extra in income, how much do you spend? How much more do you spend? This is marginal propensity to consume. And it's also marginal, so 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume is equal to the marginal propensity to save. Because the probability of you saving plus the probability of you spending should be equal to 100%. Right. So here we can see a simplified two-sector version of the Keynesian cross model. Okay, where we assume the saving function and the consumption function. Saving function plus consumption function should be equal to 1. So slope 1 minus c plus c should be equal to 1. That should be the universal or the all-purpose probabilities of the outcomes. So yeah, that shows the relation of saving, of consumption, endogenous and exogenous factors. Once again, under plan aggregate expenditure, there's also what we call investment. So here we see plan investment, or IP, is assumed to be an exogenous fixed value determined outside the model. So we don't know what influences businesses' decision to increase investment or to decrease investments. It's outside of our model's control. It could be affected by interest rates. It could be affected by CFO, CEO, COO perception of future years' business outlook and whatnot. And this is what Keynes coined the animal spirit. So this is the idea that you really don't know what. This is where psychology and economics really overlaps. It's the psychology of how firms perceive the future to be. Okay. So equilibrium. This is where plan aggregate expenditure would always be at the optimal point or at the equilibrium point, where it is at the 45-degree angle between real GDP, real GDP output, and plan aggregate expenditure GDP output. Why? Okay. So if PAE, if plan aggregate expenditure is greater, or has deviations from the 45-degree angle, then what we have is a gap. Is a gap that shows there is more real aggregate GDP than there are planned aggregate expenditures. So that would decrease in the short run. If there's less, then it will increase in the long run. Okay, so adding planned investment to consumption gives economies planned aggregate expenditures and household planned consumption. So that's sort of equilibrium. So using this models, we could really model consumer confidence and how households want to save. And we will be able to understand the effects of how changes in consumer confidence, changes in consumer spending, changes in business confidence, and changes in business investment will affect the GDP in relation to plan aggregate expenditure. Okay. Then we want to talk about a version of the fiscal policies. So we then talk about the government sector, the foreign sector, government spending. So these are all different sections that goes into planned aggregate expenditure. And the multiplier, substantiation, stock market, and Keynesian class overview. All right, so this is a pretty good review, and I think it's pretty comprehensive, going over all of the content for week 12. Week 11, talking about GDP, talking about the Keynesian cross, and talking about just a really good introduction to macroeconomics. So I do recommend you look at the textbook again. I do recommend you go through the quiz, and then we're also going to go over the textbook in a later video, and we're also going to go over the quizzes and go over the practice tests in another video. So I do hope you took a lot away from this video. I do take a lot from this review video, and I'll see you guys next time. So take care, all the best in your studyings. I'm still gonna stay up, do another review video probably. It's 2:35, but I still have 1.5 cups of coffee. So yeah, thanks for coming along. I'll see you guys next time. So take care and goodbye.